I've started a little ritual. Every evening when I get home from work, I take a walk, and that's for three reasons. One's just for exercise, two, to put in some headphones, listen to podcasts and just decompress after the day. But three is to go and to shoot photographs on my iPhone. And the reason for that is I think a lot of photographers spend a lot of time trying to build up a lot of very fancy gear, thinking that that's going to make their photography better. But much more important is learning as a photographer how to notice a good scene and especially to notice good light when you see it. So that's what that does for me. Those walks in the evening, I'm on the lookout for good light, shooting them on the iPhone, and then my goal is to post one photo a day to my Instagram account and keep that ticking over. You can sometimes see good light, but the photo that comes out on your phone is a little average. And there are ways using particular apps and some editing techniques on your phone to get that average photo looking really great. And I've had a couple of people ask me recently, what apps do you use and what techniques do you use? So in this short tutorial, I'm just going to show you some of the apps and some of the techniques. So a good example of an image that was sort of an average image was this one I took the other night. I really liked the light coming in through the trees, the grass in the foreground, and some of the clouds in the background looked quite interesting. But I knew when I took it that it probably wasn't the best looking as is. There's no way I'm going to post it like this, but I know this is kind of a prime candidate to be made to look like a good photograph using the right apps. So this is an HDR shot out of the iPhone's HDR, so it's bracketing the exposure for me, and so theoretically it should have a lot of detail that I can use as well. So the first app I'm going to jump into is Snapseed, and this is usually where I start for most editing because it's kind of a good app for sort of all the general stuff that needs to get done, exposure correction and correcting tilt and bringing back some of the details. So after this app, it should give me a good base to get a little bit more creative with it. So first thing to do is correct some of the distortion. So I'll jump into Transform, and this will just correct perspective. If you can see how it warps, usually because the iPhone's quite a wide angle lens, so this works especially if you're shooting buildings, you'll notice that it distorts some of those straight lines of the buildings, and in this case obviously the trees. So in this case you can correct some of those lines by just dragging around. Again, you can also correct left to right as well if there's some distortion. It'd be quite nice to get that sun more central there, it's great. And then just to correct that horizon line, if I go down to rotate, I can just correct. It's mostly there, but that's fine. That just makes sure that I've got everything kind of where I want it in terms of layout, and my horizon line is obviously on that bottom third. I'm still using photography basics obviously to get a good shot. Then I'm going to jump into Tune Image, and this is going to help me bring back a lot of this detail. Where I usually like to start is Ambience here. And Ambience will just show me how much I've got to play with. Okay, there's quite a lot in there which I can see I can bring back, which is great. I don't want to overcook this, because you can see it sort of adds a lot of saturation. But if I dial that back, it brings back some of those, especially the detail in the grass here. Let's just see, brightness, I could maybe bring up a touch. If I scroll down here to shadows, I can bring back some of the shadow detail in those trees just by dragging this to the right here a little bit, and in the grass you can see it's coming through. And if I want to bring back some of this highlight detail in the cloud as well, if I slide down to highlights, and I'm going to drag it to the left, just to darken those down and bring back some detail there. It's very orange at the moment. Obviously it's going to be orange because it's sunset, and that's fine. But it might be just a touch too much. So if I slide down to warmth here and just a little bit to the left, I can just normalize that a little bit. Click tick, and that's going to apply those changes. A great tool in this is Detail. So if I head into Details here, it's got two options, Sharpening and Structure. I stay away from Sharpening by and large, maybe just a touch, but Structure is a great tool. I'm going to overdo it totally so you can see what it does. If I slide this all the way to the right, can you see how much detail it's bringing back here, especially in those grass and the clouds? It's looking a bit too HDR-y for me, and you're getting a bit of haloing, but it's you can see how hard it will work for you. Basically what it's doing is it's looking for edges, and it's trying to give you some intelligent contrast just on those edges. So usually I use this at about 20 or 30, somewhere like, I'm going to leave it at about 35, 36. So that looks pretty good. If I hit tick there and apply those, you can see before and after now already, we've made quite a dramatic difference on that. So that's looking pretty good. Let's add a vignette. So if we head over to vignette here, obviously what we want to do is put vignette center on the sun. So we're going to keep this area lighter, and it's going to move to dark to the outside, so we focus in on that middle. So I don't want it quite that dark. You've got two options in here, outer brightness and inner brightness. If we head to outer brightness, just dial it up a bit. Maybe we'll probably want it about minus say -15. We could even just brighten up that center by dragging to the right in the brightness as well to 10. There we go. So you can see, just darken that down. You can see we've got loads of detail back and loads of clarity. Okay, something we could do is add some lens blur. Okay, now with lens blur, what I like to do is think, what kind of blur would make sense here? I can't just add blur anywhere, like this looks ridiculous. I need to still think like a photographer. So if I've got a very nice prime on this set at a shallow depth of field, the foreground, if I'm focusing on the trees here, the foreground realistically could be out of focus and coming into focus as we hit further and further away. So an elliptical doesn't make sense, but if I move over here to linear, which is basically your tilt shift equivalent, and I stretch this out so that you've got blurred edges at the top and bottom here, and I drag this up, what I'm doing, I'm making sure there's no blur on the clouds, because that also doesn't make sense. They're obviously far off in the distance and wouldn't be blurred out. But the foreground to those tree lines could effectively be a bit blurry, and that might add some interest. So if I do that sort of thing, I can obviously change the amount of blur I add as well. I'm going to leave it on that for now. It also adds a little bit of vignette, so it darkens up the foreground. If I hit OK, that's going to look fairly realistic. It's as if I'm shooting on a shallow depth of field, but I'm throwing it to the far distance, and the foreground is kind of blurring out. That looks quite realistic. So before and after, just to see before and after, just hold on your image and we'll see what you've done. So already we've made quite a big difference here. Maybe the last thing I'm going to do is add a bit of HDR. Okay, now HDR is going to look ridiculous, but if you use HDR very sparingly, you'll find it'll just bring back some color and it'll bring back some interest in the shot. Can you see that? So probably what I want to do is add that to maybe about 10. There we go. So within Snapseed, this is how much we've done so far, and that's quite dramatic already. So I think this gives us a good basis. Maybe I want to add, just again, I want to go back to tune image, and I just want to brighten it up just a touch. But I think now we're ready to export. So if I hit save and save a copy, that's going to save a copy with all those changes to my albums. And then we can move on to the next app. And this is where we can get a little bit more creative, because I know I've got a solid base now to work on. I shoot a lot of these shots with the sun in the background because I think it looks pretty good, and you can add some very interesting lighting effects and make it look quite dramatic. An app I quite like to use, it's a little tricky to use, but if you get it right, the effect is great, is called Raise. And what Raise will do, if I open up this image that I'm working on here again, if I center this, if you can see what's happening with those rays there, it's basically saying that whatever this little point is here is going to be the point that the rays emanate from. So obviously in this case I need to put this right on the sun there. And if you can see how those rays are coming in through the trees now, and also it's sort of shining in through the grass here as well. You've got a few options here. To be very honest, I find this a little tricky to use. Length of rays I don't usually touch, but you can see that's how much spread you're getting throughout the image. Threshold's really useful though. If you dial threshold back, it's how far those rays are going to spread out from that source. And if I keep it quite small here, you can just see that it's quite highlighted against the trees coming through, but it's not killing too much of the sky. And that's what I want. If you want to change the color, you can. I quite like what it's doing there with that yellow, and also changing the opacity of the rays again, but I really don't want to do that. So that's simple. If I just leave it like that, I've now got that sun coming through as if there's a bit of haze or smoke in the air, and it's now picking up those rays of light coming in through the trees. If I hit at the top here and I hit save, another app I like to use, which helps accentuate light, especially when it's coming into your lens, is called Lens Distortions. It's a fairly new one, and if you purchase this little pack here called Light Hits within the app, what they've done is they've taken shots of actual lens flares into high-end cameras, and they've scanned them for you and put them in this app here. So if we just click on a distortion here, and we can pinch, zoom, rotate, and obviously we're going to place this right over the top of our light source, which is going to give us an interesting, more interesting than the iPhone can manage. It's going to give us an interesting flare into the lens there. Okay, I don't really like that one. So let me pick something. Let's pick this star-shaped guy. Pinch and zoom and place that right over. That looks good. I like that. Okay, so you've got some options here. Once you've got it placed, brightness, I want to leave. Opacity, I want it at full tilt. Contrast, I'm going to leave. Okay, saturation, I'm going to pump right up to the top. I'll show you why in a second. And then if we go to color, basically we can see what sort of color we want that flare to be. It's a little bit more difficult to tell unless you've got your saturation pumped right up. We want it kind of quite orangey, so over here somewhere looks pretty good. And then if we head back over to saturation, we can dial it back down. So we like the look of it. Somewhere about there. Looks pretty good to me. Okay, and then if we save this image, we save it back to our library. And then the last app I like to use to clean stuff up and sort of to give it a grade or a look. I used to use ViscoCam a lot of people still do. It's a great app. But one I'm trying out at the moment I'm really enjoying is called Darkroom, because I think it's got a lot more control than Visco, and I'll show you why. So if we head over here to this image that we're working on, this is the last stage we've got to, and if we click on the second tab at the bottom here, this gives us our different looks. And we can head through as a load of different feels and filmic looks, very similar to Visco if you're familiar with it. I want to head over to, I quite enjoy P200 here. And what this is going to do is give me that feel which I like. I tend to use similar looks on all my photographs because then they kind of feel like each other. When you look at it Instagram, it looks like a set and looks like it comes from the same photographer. The great thing about this app is the control you have in curves. So if you head along to this icon here, if you're familiar with curves in Photoshop, what this is going to do is let you select, see across the top here, you've got blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights and whites. You can dial those up and down individually, and you can really hone the different elements. You can watch what that's doing to the clouds up the top there, the different elements, so you can see how much contrast you're adding where. And I quite like that. I want to dial maybe blacks up a touch to fade them out, and that looks good. That looks pretty good to me. Maybe a little bit saturated, but I'll fix that in a second. If I head over to my reds here, you can see I've got a bit more reds in and a bit more greens. I'm going to bring that down in the shadows. And this is just something I know from experience that I like. And then up in the highlights and midtones a bit. And what that's going to do is, because the red and the greens are boosted in the midtones and highlights, red and green together is brown, it's going to give me nice brown tones. If I head to the blue at the bottom, I always like to just boost some blues into the shadows and the blacks there. So that's kind of a nice look. I like that. And if you head back one icon here, you've just got your basic brightness, which I think I'll keep it where it is. I'm going to dial back that contrast a little bit. It was a little bit too much. Saturation, I quite like the colors actually, so I'm going to leave it where it is. Temperature, I might warm it up a touch now, actually, seeing as I dialed it back earlier, and it is sunset. Fade, Visco fans will love this. Obviously it can give you a very faded image. I like just a touch, not too much. Vignette looks good to me, not too much. Sharpness, I'm going to dial that back a bit. I don't like what some of these apps do with sharpness. Okay, and that's looking pretty good to me. I'm going to go share at the top, and I'm going to save a copy. And then if I head out from there, I can head over to my photos, and we can see we started with, let's see, where were we? We started with this image here. As you can see, it's very flat, and you don't feel like maybe you can get that much from that image, and we ended up just taking it through a few apps with something that looks like that. So my last stage would be to take it into Instagram. I usually done all the editing I want to do by the time I get to Instagram, and maybe a couple more tweaks, and then I can post from there. I hope this has helped. I'd love to know in the comments what apps you use, and look forward to seeing your photos.